Even worse, it's damn good science fiction. Painful though it is to make such an admission, I would have been proud to have written Encounter with Tiber myself. What more can you ask for?
Thank you, Buzz. Come and be seated. Thank you. A few lights. I think a little bit of lights, huh? A little bit of light. Buzz, fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. Let me go back to the beginning. Basically, before you even set foot on that ship that took you to the moon, what were the criteria? What were the demands that were placed upon an astronaut, and why were you picked, do you think, to go to the moon?
Well, initially, I was a fighter pilot when the criteria came out after Yuri Gagarin flew, and well, even before that, we selected Mercury astronauts. They had to be test pilots, and a lot of you may have seen The Right Stuff. It wasn't really quite that bad. That was very exaggerated. But clearly, you needed to have followed a career that led to being a test pilot. We didn't know what space was going to be like, and that's why we put those original people through some pretty exacting challenges physically and emotionally. When the second group came along, I was at MIT. I'd finished flying fighters in Germany, and but I decided to volunteer for the second group anyway, along with my good friend Ed White. He was at West Point with me, a year behind me, but he got to Germany before I did. So he went through test pilot school, and he applied for the second group, and I did too. He was selected because he'd been through test pilot training, but I hadn't. But I was studying, my thesis was on manned orbital rendezvous, and I had combat experience. So anyway, it made NASA wonder if they really had absolutely the right criteria. So when the third group selection came along, lo and behold, you didn't have to be a test pilot anymore, and they put more emphasis on education. But they denied that my application for the second group had anything to do with that. As long as things are going right on a flight, the G-forces are experienceable by almost any healthy person. They're just not that demanding. Zero gravity is kind of weakening for muscles, and the calcium deteriorates a little bit, so you have to keep exercising. And you have to be alert. I guess the key to our sensation, our experiences on the moon, is we put just an ultimate high premium on being alert for anything that might go wrong. That's where our attention was focused. It was not on the greater meaning of things, the philosophy, or the beauty of this or that. Incidentally, you can't see the Great Wall of China from the moon.
You can't, huh?
No, you can barely see it from orbit, but that's a little journalistic misquoting.
Right. So was there any point during the program, after your selection to be an astronaut, and from the point that you set foot on the ship, that you had second thoughts and thought, geez, man, I wish I wasn't doing this now?
Well, no, not really second thoughts. There are times when, as the progression of your activity, of your choice, moves on to a point where you wonder whether you got into the right business or not, and then you think, well, sure I did. But you do get into a rotational progression, moving toward what you got into, and I can remember after my first flight in the two-man Gemini, I didn't really care for a lot of the public appearances. They were filling of anxiety, stage fright, prepare for speech for the Congress and things like that. They were not what you'd call an introverted fighter pilot really wants to do. So I wasn't sure whether I wanted all that attention from the first landing. It'd be nice to maybe go the second or third or fourth, do more interesting things. But that was just a wishful thinking, and it wasn't even a serious one, because by that stage you're part of a team, and you're there, and I wouldn't give anything for the opportunities that came my way and the challenges that they brought with it for my own dealing with my own my own obstacles that I had to overcome.
I was going to say, how did you...
I'm an alcoholic, and I have 19 years of sobriety, and that's one of the biggest challenges that I've ever experienced. And it's one of the most satisfying too, and that came along as the result of all of the maybe the accelerated anxiety that comes along.
Was that something to do with the overnight celebrity that you found yourself with? I mean, from going from...
Oh yeah. Well, it certainly put me into a situation that gradually brought about what genetically, because of my parents and others in the family, was going to happen anyway, sooner or later. And it gave me a chance to deal with it at just the right time. Timing is really wonderful. We've got wonderful treatment facilities. We've got wonderful programs now that deal with people. And I got to say that I'm a far better person than I ever would have been without having to deal with those things. I've got a sense of peace and tranquility most of the time that I think I never would have had without dealing with challenges.
Let's get back to that flight. July 16th, 1969, you're about to take off. How did you sleep the night before? What did you have for breakfast? Did you have a good breakfast?
Well, we didn't sleep very well. Not when you've got those things coming to fruition now. And I can remember, well, this is after breakfast. The breakfast, we had the backup crew there, and we had the administrator of NASA, wonderful gent by the name of Tom Paine. He was the administrator. He died from cancer, maybe 15 years ago. Great future thinking person. But he really said a meaningful thing to us. Now, there are crew rotations that, of course, you get into. You're on the backup crew, and the prime crew is going to fly, and they've got 2 more crews assigned for the next 2 missions, so the backup crew skips the next 2 and then goes prime crew on the next one. And the prime crew, if it wants to fly again, is going to have to wait a number of missions before it gets a chance again. But he said to us, he said, now listen, if anything doesn't look quite right, safety is the most important thing. If it doesn't look right, you just come on back home and I'll see to it that you get on the next flight. Well, I don't think that would have happened, but it was indicative of the concern that he had and how he felt that our well-being was paramount.
But the journey to the moon was really to fulfill JFK's dream, wasn't it? Of the 60s era would end until man had stepped on the moon. Do you think that as we just got in there, July of 1969, in the last year, there was a race with the Russians? Was there ever a thought in your mind that maybe a corner might have been cut just to do it?
I don't think so. We made some really gutsy decisions, and this is pioneering activity, and you're doing the best that you can with the harnessed talent of industry, academia, and government, dedicated, and we were adequately financed. But when you look at one fact, the second Apollo flight, the first one was to test out the command module, so they were up for 10 days in Earth orbit. The second and third flight were going to be tests of the lunar landing craft. But it wasn't ready, so we had to fly another flight, and I am quite familiar with that situation because the way the crews were assigned, Neil Armstrong, Jim Lovell, and Buzz Aldrin were on the backup crew for the third flight, which was going to fly a lander in Earth orbit. The lander for the second flight wasn't ready, so that crew for the third flight was moved to the second flight so that the crew that was very familiar with the lander would fly it as the third flight when it became ready. And in the meantime, Mike Collins had a problem with his neck and back and needed an operation, so he dropped out. Jim Lovell moved in with Frank Borman and Bill Anders on the second flight, and that left Neil Armstrong and myself backing up that flight along with Fred Hayes. So that mission was the second flight, and the command module And they decided, well, let's put it in a big orbit around the Earth. And that orbit kept getting bigger and bigger, and pretty soon they said, let's send them around the moon. And if it looks good, we'll go into orbit around the moon. Now, that was a step-by-step committing based on success. And it gained us at least 6 months. And it was a gutsy thing to do. In retrospect, looking at the rare occurrence on Apollo 13, had that tank explosion occurred on Apollo 8, they didn't have a lander, lifeboat, or whatever it is, to be able to come back in. So it was that kind of a risk, but it was a wonderful mission to be a part of. I was the navigator, and Jim was in the prime crew, Jim Lovell, and we were charged with understanding how to navigate in the event the Earth tracking wasn't capable. We'd have to do a lot of sextant sightings, and it was really fascinating to be a part of seeing those early missions. Now, that was a gutsy thing to do, and you can say it was risky, but looking back in retrospect, except for the Apollo fire, which was just one of those freak things that kind of happened very early when you're developing things, we had just phenomenal success in Apollo. I guess we believed that crew survival on an Apollo flight was 99%. And at mission success, we were just guessing before our flight, just asking each other. And I think between the three of us, Neil, Mike, and I, it was about 70% that we would successfully accomplish the mission, which was to land and come back. Survival was 99%, so we might have turned back. But to actually be able to land, and of the 7 missions that went to the moon, 6 of them were able to successfully land, and that was about that same probability. So I think we really felt that we had a good team going for us. But incidents happen. This is not a risk-free world. We have to accept things, and just because they're great for TV, if something goes wrong. And incidentally, you know, all the networks have somebody down there at the Cape for each shuttle launch, but you don't see it except on CNN, and then they cut out after the solid rockets are separated. Why do the networks send their people down there? In case there's an accident. That's why they're there.
Buzz, just between you and me and the 4 walls and a couple of thousand people, when Neil went down those steps on the moon and uttered those immortal words, "A giant leap for mankind," he didn't make that up himself, did he?
Well, you know, I've been waiting a few years to tell you this. Neil does not tell everyone everything that's going on in his mind. I actually felt that the same individual from the U.S. Information Agency that I know had discussed with the Apollo 8 crew the advisability, the appropriateness of quoting from Genesis over Christmas. I felt that he might have had something to do with it. But later, many years later, I talked to him and asked him, and he said, no, he didn't. So I guess I got to believe that Neil had some other brilliance, thinking, and surprising things would come when he would speak. Really, he was very, very reserved, but very brilliant individual. Now, I know that if I'd been given that privilege of being first and that rather weighty responsibility, I wouldn't have trusted my own imagination. I would have consulted people. And you know what I'd have said afterward? None of your business.
That's why I'm asking
Presidents, presidents are, and all chief executives have speechwriters, and they don't blindly take what's thrown at them. They inspire, they massage things, and that's what an event like that deserves. It doesn't deserve a fighter pilot, test pilot's outlook on momentous.
Michael Collins.
There was very good words, incidentally. Wonderful.
They were, yeah. Michael Collins going all that way. How do you think he felt when he didn't get to stand on the moon?
It wasn't a surprise. It was I'm sure, a disappointment, but not everyone was going to be able to fly in the lunar module. Other people had to fly in the command module. And initially, the three groups that were eligible, there were a few of the later astronauts that came in who were going to fly later in Apollo, but it was only the first three groups, 7 people, plus 9 people, plus 14 in our group. And, of course, we lost several in aircraft accidents. So by the time we went to the moon, there were only about 18 people that made up to that 6 crews, so 3 missions. What was the question again?
I said, how do you feel Mike felt about being left
anyway,
out?
so as we got down there, it became clear that the intensive training for the landers just wouldn't allow everyone to continue to fly helicopters, so they sort of discontinued a third or a half of the people from the helicopter flying that was contributing directly to the lunar lander simulators in a building, and then in helicopter similar flying, and then in that rather precarious thing that looked like a bedstead that was flying on a jet engine and then had other thrusters, and it was a pretty hazardous machine to fly in. And I guess being a practical person, not wanting to avoid something because I volunteer for whatever comes along if I think it's appropriate, but to be realistic, being the lunar module pilot, not the commander's in charge. Okay, he's going to do the good things, the challenging things, like the rendezvous docking and like the liftoff and the landing, except the landing of the command module. Mike had to do that. But I couldn't imagine, and neither could a number of us, circumstances whereby the commander or his systems, his controls, wouldn't be working that would require the co-pilot, the lunar module pilot, to make a manual landing. That just wasn't going to happen. We'd have aborted and come back, because if anything isn't quite right, you're going to come back. So not everyone continued the full, complete training in those lunar landing training vehicles. But Mike knew that at least for his first mission, he probably wasn't going to be a lunar module pilot or a commander. Next time around, he might have had that opportunity. But all three of us, when we came back, we could see there were a lot of impatient people waiting in line and a limited number of flights, and it really wouldn't have been fair to have been in the right place at the right time for the first landing and then to hog another flight at the expense of someone else not being able. So we all, at that point, decided not to fly again, and we went our different ways.
Did you ever meet up with the guys?
Yes, we have. Well, as a crew, it's a little disappointing, and as a reunion bunch of the pioneers, it's been a little unsatisfactory from my perspective that we haven't developed a bit more of a esprit de corps. There's still a competitiveness and a little jealousy, a little envy, and going different ways. You'll find that in just about every profession. I tried to get people to come together about 10, 15 years ago, and it was kind of frustrating. Some people want to and others don't.
With John Glenn going up again, though, do you ever get the taste that you'd want to do it?
Well, I think it's a wonderful symbolic occurrence, and it came about for varieties of reasons. Number one, because I think he wanted to do that. He didn't want to hang around after being the first American to orbit, and he saw other challenges, and he's carried those out very well. He was the only one of the first 7 that I knew before. I was a second lieutenant right into Korea, and we were assigned to the same Air Force fighter squadron. He was a Marine pilot as a captain who was attached to the Air Force Sabre jet unit. And he shot down a couple of MiGs, and I had the opportunity to do the same thing. That's where I first met him, and I think it's just a wonderful symbology, and I enjoy people asking me what I think about it. What I think about it doesn't care. What you think about it does, because it indicates to me that there is a growing interest in that sort of thing, and we can cultivate that And I think it has something to do with the desire to want to, maybe vicariously or leading to eventual participation. I look on John Glenn's flight again as sort of the beginning of tourism in space. And to me, that's the most important thing that we can be doing now. And I really believe it'll happen before a return to the moon or onto Mars. But I'm ready to help out planning either way. But I really think that the economy of large numbers of flights over and over again will establish the right kinds of rocket systems that deliver things to orbit. And if we design them properly, that first stage that goes with the second stage, we can use 3 or 4 of them around a central stage like the Saturn rocket, and those 4 can come back and fly, and we reuse them again. We can get a lot of economy, and that's what will take the hotels up there.
Don't you think that maybe to move on into the next stage, I mean, all these things, jet engines, rockets, space exploration, which really we must accept the point that it was to do with a little bit of this Cold War, rivalry with Russia. Doesn't progress come out of conflict and the thought of conflict, maybe?
It
and
certainly,
the fact is the world
yes.
is so peaceful,
No,
that's why we're not moving on?
Certainly did, and it the Cold War enabled us to focus on our future, our security that was threatened, and you know, really the significance of Apollo was that it was a race to the moon, but it was a commitment, and we should be proud that we carried out that commitment. I'm not sure that over a long period of time Americans are well known for carrying out their commitments. They tend to lose direction, they lose focus. And but the fact that we won that, we carried out that commitment. It was not lost on the Soviets. And years later, when it looked as though there might be another thing that we could make a commitment to, and that one would nullify the Soviet massive investment in intercontinental missiles with nuclear warheads. And if our president said, man, we're going to charge ahead with that, they didn't want that to happen at all, I tell you. And they tried to talk us out of it. Nuclear freeze, whatever else they wanted to. They loved the label Star Wars because it was ridiculing something. Well, anyway, Reagan didn't back down. Gorbachev had to change direction. So whether you really agree with all of those things or not, going to the moon and making that commitment and standing tall ended the Cold War. A lot before many people thought it would. We've got a rather chaotic world right now, and I'm not sure that it's a world that cooperates all that much. So instead of competition, we now need to cooperate to get things done. But everybody's looking at their own agenda now, and their agendas are kind of short-term. They're not as long-term as maybe they were during the Cold War. And that does make it difficult. The European Space Agency has not had it easy trying to bring together those countries and work out a cooperative plan that's cheaper than the same resources doing it under one strong leadership. And we can have lots of resources under one strong leadership, but then to fritter that away and deal it out just because we love international cooperation may not be cheaper that way. It might fall apart. It might come apart at the seams. We've made a pretty big commitment to getting the Russians into the space station, but it's been at a cost that we've had to give up a good number of things to do that.
What do you say to that band of people? I mean, there's always people that decry achievement, and there's a band of people going around now saying the whole thing never happened. It was done in Arizona and all the rest of it.
I've had my days with the UFO people and the astrology people. I hope you saw Contact the other night. And I hope you maybe have the opportunity to read another Carl Sagan's book, The Demon-Haunted World. Wonderful, but my wife still loves being a whatever she is. whatever that sign is. How do you know? No, that's not it. Let me. Do we want to take a question? I want to take about 3 or 4 minutes right at the end.
Take about 3 or 4 questions. Yeah, there we go. How would you rev up public support for continued manned spaceflight?
Well, I would have some organizations, and there are a couple. This is called Space Voyages. This is called Space Adventures. And it's kind of a marrying of a travel or an expedition concern with a travel agency, and then they begin to look at experiences. And one in particular has trips to Kennedy Space Center to see a shuttle launch, visit Space Camp, do a number of other things. It may cost a couple of $1,000, or go to Star City, get a tour of the Russian facilities, fly in a MiG-25, a zero-G airplane. These are the steps, and I see them as gradually building to the next step, which is a suborbital flight, maybe a flight in a Concorde, maybe some other fascinating adventure travel, like submersibles. Look at the Titanic. I think there are not too many opportunities, but I think those adventure travel that involved, and then the hope that it's available not just to the affluent, and these things are going to be expensive. Orbital spaceflight is going to be expensive when it first starts out. And that's why I'm developing slowly and with care what I call share space. It's a lottery-like opportunity to spread around the availability for some of the smaller ones and some of the big ones. We'll use the big attention-getting, great fanfare, great extravaganza drawings for the winner, or a couple of winners, and they'll get some of the lesser prizes, and just like a lottery has a $5 million prize and a many $1,000 prizes, a large number, $100 prizes. We'll do that sort of thing too, and build the enthusiasm. And I think that's the way we'll do it. And maybe that enthusiasm and that support of millions of people will begin to get the lethargy of the status quo of the big corporations and the bureaucracy of the government to get behind the more practical ways, the really practical ways of bringing about tourism.
Sure. The cooperation, Russian-American cooperation over the space station, what are we giving up by doing that, do you think?
We're giving up building a crew rescue vehicle. We're going to rely on them for a period of time. That means that in the building phase, it's 5 years or so, that a good significant amount of the people up there are going to be Russians, more so than they would be if it were more our space station. The propulsion unit was going to be Russian. So if it's kind of like if they choose to not play, your big expensive toy is going to come down and burn up unless you pay them the additional wages, or they kind of have you over the barrel. This has its other side. We've kept a large number of their engineers and scientists from working for Gaddafi and other people that we just assumed them not go work for. And we've promoted a rapport and a better relationship. Russia's going through a lot of real serious growing pains now.
Final question, gentleman over there. Yes, sir. Yeah. The photograph of the flag in the video was flapping in the wind.
There is no air on the moon. Okay, but when you push the proceed button on the lunar ascent program, you enable the computer to then send the signal, the engine lights, and all the jet exhaust, the rocket exhaust, comes out and goes outward. Doesn't billow up, it just goes straight outward, and anything in its way gets really tossed around.
I think you meant when you were planting the flag for the first time, when you planted the flag in the
When
surface.
we put the flag in?
Yeah. The end of it seemed to flap a little bit like that.
Oh, well, the pole was like this, and the flag would have just been very dull-looking, drooping down, if we didn't have a top thing snap into position and hold it straight out. And then it was telescoping, but it didn't telescope out, so we had to kind of wiggle it a little bit so that it looked like it wasn't all bunched at one end to the other. And that gave it the impression that it was waving in the wind.
Buzz,
I want to do
yeah,
this.
do this thing.
Yeah.
Buzz, I tell you, I saw in your other video that your footsteps are going to remain on the moon for 500,000 years. I think your imprint in history will be a lot longer than that. Thank you very much.
This is a February issue. This is a February issue of National Geographic, and in here is a somewhere there's a picture of that boot print that I think I took that slide out. Anyway, I just want you to know I took that picture. It says that Neil took it in here.
The rivalry is still there. Take us home, Buzz. Engage.
If we can dim the lights just for a moment and show the star field. We got a minute? I want to take you on an imaginary trip. Imagine that there's stars on here the way there were a little bit ago, and maybe they'll come back. The last slide, if you can, please. Imagine you're in a classroom in a lecture hall on a planet 26 light years from Earth, in the planetary system of the summer star Vega that was featured in Carl Sagan's Contact. Now the year is 2499, and your instructor is identifying on a hologram the original world of your human race. He points to Sol, and then he focuses on the third planet from the sun, the Earth. Centuries ago that humanity first stepped off the planet Earth and onto another world. That world was the Earth's only moon. And looking back, the step seems to be a small one. Only 240,000 miles, just a little over what light travels in 1 second. But remember, until that time, humanity was not able to leave the Earth. It didn't have the knowledge or the means. That moment was a most important moment in our history. The time when it became possible to explore beyond the surface of that single planet, to realize our destiny of sending life to cold and empty worlds. What a time to have been alive. This is your instructor now. What I wouldn't give to have been there on Earth at that time. Just think of the adventure, the vision, the sense of destiny that surely must have existed when humanity first set foot on another world to explore, and then after a brief wait, to venture outward again to settle the universe. Now those are the thoughts and feelings that countless future generations will have as they think back on the second half of the 20th century. As Mecca is to the Muslim, and Jerusalem is to many Christians and Jews, so the earth may become to the future generations of humanity the place from which they sprang, the holiest of holy origins, or their genesis. You're here at that very moment in history. And this is just the beginning. And I'm happy to have joined you with wonderful moon-sun viewing. Thank you very much.
Colonel BuzzAldrin, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay. I've got a group that I need to go to right now.